and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud. This is a Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book number 834, and it is titled The Younger Generation and Its Attitude Toward Life, and it is written by Ralph Oppenheim, and it is copyrighted 1927. So the generation it is referring to is dead. But this is the younger generation of that time's attitude toward life. And this is part 3, and we start off on chapter 3. And chapter 3 is titled Crime. Alrighty. Every movement has what Roosevelt called its lunatic fringe. There is always a bad extreme, a touch of violence and lawlessness. Thus, the contention that the whole younger generation is a bunch of criminals because certain boys and girls have committed some shocking crimes is hardly fair. Such crimes are not typical of our youth today, but represent only a small percentage who have been completely unbalanced by the movement, have become fanatics, as it were. The same thing happened when Christianity first swept the world. These extremists merely overdid the thing, carried the revolt to the very limit. For them, it was not enough to defy certain conventions, to flout their parents, to go in for jazz, drinking, and sex. They had to throw off all restraint, breaking up all prevailing law and order. Consequently, they turned to crime. Thus we find some boys and girls, even from the most respectable families, and with the best upbringing parents could give, committing brutal, degenerate murders. We find gangs of youthful bandits, dope-crazed youngsters who do not realize what it means to take a human life. But I don't think the present crime wave, possibly the worst America has confronted, is to be blamed altogether on the younger generation, although it is doubtless a part of the big movement. There are plenty of older criminals who have always been enemies of society, and to whom the breaking of old traditions meant a new opportunity for cutting loose. The war, with its wholesale slaughter, had the effect of lowering the value on human life, of making individual murders seem almost insignificant. It taught those men, directly or indirectly, to shoot down in cold blood, to use their deadly weapons, and such weapons as machine gun came right out of the war, without the slightest hesitation. Prohibition also did its share. It gave rise to an entirely new type of criminal, the bootlegger. This led to the terrific gang warfare, the practice of hijacking, which is being waged so openly at the present time. And here the government finds itself practically powerless, because for the first time the people are half on the side of the criminals. They want their liquor, and these men are the only mediums through which they can get it. I have dealt with this situation somewhat briefly because, while it is undoubtedly one of the vital problems of the day, it plays only a small part in the revolt of the younger generation. It is the left fringe of the left wing, the worst extreme, and therefore not to be thought characteristic of our boys and girls. Now, that referred to the war, and that is World War I. World War II hadn't happened yet. So, okay, next chapter, chapter 4, Parents and Children. While, as I have said, the clash between the older and younger generations is as old as the race, the present attitude of the children toward their parents makes it one of the most unique and vital problems the world has ever confronted. In the old days, the parents had a specific set of rules under which to bring up their children. Christianity, all the traditions of Puritanism, supplied these rules, and the word God, added to discipline, was sufficient to drill them into the boys and girls. In other words, if the children broke any of the rules, they were aware of the fact that they had sinned, and consequently they took their punishment with the knowledge that they deserved it. Aside from certain moral conventions about right and wrong, some of the chief rules were as follows. General rules. 1. The father was the head of the household. a law handed down from the very beginnings of civilization. The father was the undisputed ruler of the average family. His wife and children must regard his word as law and obey him. For his part, he must set a good example to them, lest the sin of the father be visited upon the children, and must strive to lead a moral, upright life. Now, of course, not all fathers did this, but if they had shortcomings, they were not to show them to their children. By their conduct at home, they must make good models. 2. Children must honor their parents. This is right out of the Ten Commandments, was a most rigid convention. The child must constantly recognize the fact that his parents were older than he was, and consequently he must respect them, look up to them. Whatever his parents did or said was correct, and their wishes must be obeyed. 3. Certain subjects must not be discussed by parents and children. We of today can scarcely imagine the stress that was laid on this rule. For example, it was a heinous sin for parents and children to discuss sex. Such problems were not even to be thought of. The word must never be mentioned in the home. Rules for boys. 1. Boys should pattern themselves after their father. The prime ambition of a boy should be to follow his father's footsteps, to preserve the honor of his father's name. Consequently, he must look upon his father as his chief advisor and mentor. 2. Boys must either learn a trade or go into a profession, i.e., through college. The choice, as a rule, was left to the parents and was often based on an old family custom. For instance, one family might have a tradition that the eldest son of each generation must be a doctor. The son would accept this, unless he had an exceptional nature, and strive for the goal that was already set for him. On the other hand, if the family was in bad straits, it was up to the boy to go to work and support them. The father would usually choose his trade and get him his first position. 3. If boys break loose, they must do so in secret. This may seem a rather strange rule, but it was a tact agreement between parents and children. Nature made people accept the fact that when the average boy reaches adolescence, he is inclined to have a brief fling, a period when he sows his wild oats. But such a thing was morally sinful. Therefore, the boy must do it on the sly, must not let his parents find out about it. If they did find out, he was disgraced. Rules for girls. 1. A girl should pattern herself after her mother. This is same as the boy following his father. She must go to her mother for advice, though never advise on the forbidden subjects, and learn how a woman should conduct herself in social life. 2. Virginity was a girl's most important asset. A girl who lost her virginity was unworthy of a husband. She must cherish it, must remain pure until her marriage. And this was perhaps the most important rule concerning girls. 3. Girls must be modest and reserved. Man was the fighter, the aggressor, but in women modesty and reserve was the ideal. She must dress simply, concealing her body, and she must never make advances to the man. They must seek her out and become her suitors. 4. Girls must learn to be good housekeepers. It was the wife's duty to look after her husband, to see that he lived in comfort. Therefore, she must know how to cook, clean, sew, etc. And 5. Girls must be refined. It was understood that men, on the average, were somewhat rough and untutored, because their chief duties were purely practical. They must go out and earn a living, but in their wives they look for culture and refinement. Consequently, a girl should take up some higher pursuit, like music, painting, etc. While these rules, which I obtained from a member of the older generation, may not cover the ground completely, I think they will suffice to show the general code of life and conduct under which parents used to bring up their children. Of course, some families did not adhere to them as strictly as others. Some rejected one or two, made certain concessions here and there, but taken by and large, all were steeped in the tradition, whence these rules emanated, and that tradition made the problem of handling children a far more simple one than it is today. To begin with, under such rules, parents could more or less ignore the deeper problems of their children, the problems of sex, etc. They never had to contend with such problems because they were never brought into their homes. But today they can no longer ignore them. The children come into the house and openly flaunt the subjects before their parents. They may come home drunk, or perhaps they invite a crowd in for a wild party, with drinking and promiscuous petting. And the problems are brought directly into the home through many other channels. They are discussed with candor by our books, our newspapers, our magazines, the radio, and so on. Thus, for the first time, the parents are brought face to face with brutal, undeniable facts, and unfortunately, they have found themselves surprisingly inadequate in the crisis. The old rules hold no longer. They are as dead as the traditions which give birth to them. The children flout, every one of them, scoff at the old puritanic ideas of virtue, and often look down upon their parents. Show the set of rules to a boy and girl with the modern viewpoint, and their reactions will doubtless run something like this. The boy will say, "All that is pure bunk. What dumbbells they used to be. Now look, I'll take the 3 rules about the boys. I should pattern myself after my father. The heck of a lot I'd amount to then, working in a stuffy old office," or perhaps some other criticism of his father. "And as for the second rule, nobody's going to tell me what to do or where to work. If I want to go to college, I'll go. If they say no, I'll get out and shift for myself. What do I owe them?" Then the third, "Boys should break loose in secret. That's a lot of applesauce. Why should I do it in secret? I'm not ashamed of it. And I couldn't have a good time if I did it on the sly." And so on. And the modern flapper, "Don't tell me to pattern myself after mother. She's too mid-Victorian. And when I see how she slaves after dad, it gives me a pain. No man'll get me to slave for him like that, cooking and drudging all my life. My husband will either have to get me a maid, or he eats out. And gosh, they certainly used to keep the girls in glass cases, didn't they? The poor, frail creatures. I'm glad times have changed. Now at least a girl can get some enjoyment out of life. Why shouldn't we have the same privileges as the boys? We're just as good as they are. And as for catching a husband, you can't get him with modesty these days. You've got to chase after him, grab him by the neck, and make him say I do. That stuff about refinement and culture is a lot of hokum. No one will look at these highbrow, wishy-washy girls who sit in a corner and play Chopin on the piano. No one's got to join the... Now you've got to join the gang. Show them you're a good sport. You've got to know all the latest songs and dance steps, how to wear your clothes and bring out your best attractions, and so on. Of course, if their parents were of another type, the criticism would run a little different, but I think this will illustrate the change that the new attitude of youth has brought about. What has caused this apparent inadequacy of parents? Why can they no longer command their children's respect and obedience? It seems to me that there are 2 aspects of the case. First, the parents who are trying to be young themselves, and second, the old-fashioned parents who still try to uphold the old code. Pardon me. On the first thought, it would appear that there should be no struggle between the parents who have come over, as it were, to youth's side of the fence, and their children. But as a matter of fact, the situation here is in some ways even worse than in the other case. Briefly, though the older people are going the fast pace themselves, they don't want to see their sons and daughters doing likewise. In other words, they still have the attitude that it is morally wrong, that they must keep their children away from it. In addition to this, they demand the traditional respect and obedience that parents have always received. But, to put a brutal question, how can children look up to parents who are obviously no different than themselves, who are doing all the things that they do and yet telling them it is bad? Take the following example. A very modern mother was lecturing her flapper daughter on drinking. But, argued the daughter, you do it yourself. Yes, but I'm older than you, child, the mother explained. What of it? The daughter retorted. You can't carry your liquor at all. I saw you get pretty drunk on 2 cocktails the other night. Gosh, I could drink 10 of them without losing my poise. Don't you see, I've really more right to drink than you do. Now, isn't this a perfectly logical argument? How are you going to refute it? In short, it's the old story that practicing what you preach. Though, unfortunately, even parents who do this find themselves unable to cope with the situation, which brings us to the other aspect of the case. The conflict between the old-fashioned parents and their children is a far less complicated matter. The children, and I must repeat, I refer only to those children who have the new attitude, look upon their parents as open foes, barriers which must be overcome. The older folks are back numbers, mid-Victorians, and Christly. Therefore, they are to be put in their places, and their wishes ignored. How then can parents command the respect of their children? There is, of course, the theory of rigid discipline. But, as I think my little story about the minister's son proves, it is hardly applicable to the majority of cases. The spirit which prevails among the younger generation is too strong to be subdued by mere discipline. The children must associate with other children, whose views they will presently absorb. When the parents forbid them to do certain things, they will ultimately revolt, assert themselves. What will discipline do then? If you punish them, they will think you most unjust, for in their mind they have done no wrong. The results may be disastrous. The boy or girl may pack up and leave. All right, let them starve, some parents will say. But they do not starve. They find jobs and independence, and their disrespect has increased rather than diminished. And I think we'll stop there for part 3. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in part 3, or part 4.